Margaret stood by the window of her modest second-floor apartment, gazing out over the quiet courtyard dotted with lilac bushes and gravel paths. Dusk had already settled, and the faint glow from the sparse streetlights cast soft orange-yellow glimmers onto the windowsill. To her, those flickers of light felt like the last beacons trying to cut through the gray haze of her life. She couldn't decide what felt worse, watching the deserted yard where no one ever seemed to walk anymore, or diving into the echo chamber of her own memory, a space that, with each day, unearthed new fragments of the past, whether she wanted them or not. Her thoughts kept circling back to the same question: why was her son avoiding her? The boy she had raised, protected, poured every ounce of energy and love into, why had he shut her out? A tight knot sat in her chest. Just a year ago, she had felt certain about how things would be. Ethan lived in the next building, close enough for spontaneous weekend tea, for helping out with the baby, for calm, regular family interaction. She had counted on that. But the reality had flipped upside down. Ethan had pulled away. He barely texted, rarely called, and often ignored her attempts to reach out. If he did pick up, his tone was clipped, distracted, and sometimes he didn't respond at all. Eventually, he stopped initiating any kind of contact. The only news Margaret got about his life came from his wife, Claire. As for her granddaughter, little Katie, she saw the baby so rarely it hurt. Whenever Margaret gently asked, "Maybe I could stop by?" Claire would politely but firmly deflect, "That's something you'll need to ask Ethan about, or better to check with him directly." And nothing ever came of it. Margaret had replayed their history in her head 1,000 times, searching for the moment where it might have all gone wrong. Had she said something? Done something? She'd always believed they were close. Ethan had been a sickly child. There were endless visits to doctors, long stretches stuck indoors, careful diets, sleepless nights. She had devoted herself to him, making soup, reading to him, researching specialists, even giving up social outings for years. Ethan's father had left when he was just 3. Margaret carried the weight alone, at least until she met James, her second husband, who eventually became a quiet presence in their home. But Ethan never really accepted him. The first time James tried to talk to him about discipline and routine, Ethan shot back, "You're not my dad," and that was that. Parenting responsibilities remained firmly on Margaret's shoulders. She had done her best, juggling work, housework, and a teenager who was as fragile as he was defiant. There were phases when Ethan fell in with questionable friends, stayed out late, came home with alcohol on his breath. Margaret fought for him with every fiber of her being. She wanted to shield him from the streets, from temptation, from life's cruelties. There were battles, shouting matches, sleepless nights. But eventually it seemed Ethan had steadied. He got into college, took some computer courses, landed a part-time job. Margaret had felt proud he was carving out his own path. Maybe not without bumps, but at least he was walking on solid ground. Still, she had always been a bit overbearing, that much she could admit. Her need to control every detail of Ethan's life had often pushed him to the edge. He said she suffocated him, that she was always micromanaging his decisions. But Margaret couldn't let go. He had been so weak, so vulnerable as a child. Didn't it make sense to keep helping him, reminding him, steering him right? They had lived in that constant tug-of-war, Ethan wanting freedom, Margaret terrified of letting go. Years passed. Ethan married Claire, a composed woman, polite, though a little distant. At first, Margaret had rejoiced. Her son had a family now. That's all she'd ever wanted. But Claire kept her distance, and Margaret, in her eagerness to help, often crossed boundaries, dropping by uninvited, offering unsolicited advice, criticizing the way the house was kept. She thought she was being helpful. After all, young couples make mistakes. Don't mothers usually guide their children, especially when it comes to raising kids? But Ethan didn't see it that way. To him, it was intrusion. He grew cold, withdrawn. Still, after little Katie was born, things hadn't completely fallen apart. There were birthday wishes, the occasional tea, some brief conversations. Until that one evening, the one Margaret now replayed over and over with painful clarity. She had asked Ethan to help her with her computer. She'd asked a few times before, and he always obliged, if reluctantly. But that night, something snapped. He stood up mid-sentence, rubbed his temples, and said, "I'm tired of being your tech guy. I have my own life, my own stress. I'm not your free IT support." When she tried to calm him, he stormed out, slamming the door. He didn't even take the apple turnovers she had baked for him and Claire. From that moment on, the silence between them deepened into a chasm. Margaret texted, "Ethan, sweetheart, I'm sorry if I upset you." She called, left voicemails. No answer. Claire would only shrug and say, "That's between you two. I can't speak for him." When they did happen to bump into each other near the grocery store or outside their buildings, he offered a curt, "Hey," and kept walking. Eventually, Margaret learned through someone else that he had gone abroad for vacation. And never told her. It felt like a wound she didn't know how to treat because she couldn't even see how deep it was. James, her husband, tried to console her, but his role had always been peripheral. Ethan had never respected him as a father figure. He tried, years ago, to help parent the boy, but had been pushed away. And Margaret, in her devotion to Ethan, had often left James on the sidelines. Now, with her son distant and silent, James did what he could. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked one evening. "He doesn't listen to me." Margaret didn't know either. She had tried giving Ethan space. That only made him colder. She had tried reaching out again. He shut down even harder. Nothing worked. At 61, Margaret was beginning to understand that she no longer had the energy to run up and down stairs trying to win back her child. Her heart sometimes fluttered unpredictably. Her back ached on rainy days. And emotionally, she was drained. But that relentless, aching love for her only child wouldn't let her rest. How could he cast her aside so easily? Now, staring out the window at the long, trembling shadows beneath the street lamps, she whispered her silent prayer again. "Lord, give me strength, or at least show me where I went wrong so I can fix it." She waited for some kind of sign. A door cracking open. A reason to believe that Ethan might one day speak to her again. But everything remained cold and still, like the wind just beyond the glass. And in the deepest part of her mind, another thought began to echo louder than the rest. "I took care of my own mother until her final breath. Why does my child treat me like I no longer matter?" She wiped her eyes, turned away from the window, and walked to the kitchen where her tea had long since gone cold. Life, it seemed, had moved on without her, and without Ethan it felt painfully empty. She had no choice but to keep going. But what kind of life was it when your only son pretended you no longer existed? Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring into her teacup, the liquid inside now lukewarm and flavorless. The silence around her had grown so constant that it no longer felt like an absence, more like a presence in itself. An invisible wall that hummed with unanswered questions and the ache of words left unsaid. She had once imagined her retirement years so differently. Now that she was no longer working, officially retired just a few months ago, she thought her life would be filled with family moments, especially time with her granddaughter. She had envisioned taking Katie to the park, reading her stories, watching her learn to walk. Instead, she was sidelined, cut off from those moments like a stranger looking in through a glass pane. Ethan never brought the child over. Claire never reached out. The weekends passed in quiet repetition, the soft whir of the washing machine, the sound of neighbors' footsteps on the stairs, and the absence of laughter in her living room. Her closest friends were all either occupied with their own grandchildren or too far away to visit often. When they called, they chatted cheerfully about toddlers knocking over vases or learning their ABCs. Margaret nodded along, forcing smiles even though jealousy clawed at her chest. "Why is it different for me?" she often thought. But she never said it out loud. She couldn't bear the pity. Sometimes she walked out and sat on the bench by the entrance to her building. From there, she could see the windows of Ethan and Claire's apartment. Once, she noticed the lights on well past midnight. Probably Ethan on his computer, she thought. That's what he always did when he was younger, retreat into the glowing world of screens and code when emotions overwhelmed him. One day, she gathered her courage and dialed his number after weeks of silence. The phone rang once, twice, then straight to voicemail. "Ethan, sweetheart, it's Mom. I just wanted to check in, make sure you're okay. I won't keep you. Just let me know you're all right." She hung up, unsure if the message would even be listened to. That evening, over dinner, she told James what had happened. He shrugged, his expression somewhere between empathy and helplessness. "If he doesn't want to talk, you can't force him," James said gently. "You'll just wear yourself down." "I know," Margaret whispered, though her heart rebelled at the thought of giving up. A few more days passed. Then, out of the blue, Claire called. Margaret's heart nearly stopped when she saw the name on her screen. It was late, nearly 9 o'clock, and Claire rarely initiated contact. "Hi, Mrs. Turner," Claire said, her voice tight. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "No, not at all," Margaret answered quickly. "Is everything okay?" Claire hesitated, then said, "We're going out of town for a week. Ethan and I. We need someone to look after the cat. Would you be able to help?" Margaret blinked, taken aback by the request. It was the first time in months that anyone from Ethan's household had asked her for anything. "Yes, of course," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. "But Ethan didn't want to call himself." "He's busy," Claire said after a pause. "Sorry, I should have asked sooner. We'll leave the keys with our neighbor. If you could come by once a day, feed the cat, change the water, just check the place." Margaret agreed, her voice steady even as her stomach twisted with conflicting emotions. It stung that Ethan hadn't called himself. But still, this was something. A thread. A sliver of contact. Claire gave her the dates, the instructions, and ended the call quickly. Margaret stood there for a long time afterward, phone still in hand, unsure whether she felt hopeful or heartbroken. When the day came, Margaret walked to their building, retrieved the key from the neighbor, and let herself into the apartment. The first thing she noticed was the clutter, the casual chaos of a young family's life. Toys on the floor. Crayons scattered on the coffee table. Little socks in a laundry basket by the door. And yet, the place had warmth. The faint scent of baby lotion and Claire's vanilla candles lingered in the air. It reminded Margaret painfully of the home she had once dreamed her son would have. The cat, a fluffy, indifferent creature, lounged on the couch. When it saw her, it flicked its tail, hissed once, then sauntered off toward the kitchen when she poured food into its bowl. Margaret moved through the rooms quietly, not touching anything she didn't have to. She noticed a baby blanket draped over the arm of the sofa, a small rattle left on the floor beside it. Her chest tightened. She wanted so badly to hold Katie, to kiss her tiny hands, to read her a bedtime story. But all she was allowed to do was feed the cat. She wandered into the kitchen and began tidying instinctively. There were cups left on the counter, a few crumbs here and there. As she wiped the table, her eyes landed on a calendar pinned to the fridge, days crossed out until a circled departure date. And behind the calendar, a photo of Katie smiling in a silly knit hat. Margaret stared at that picture for a long time. A few tears slipped down her cheek before she caught herself and muttered, "Don't do this. Don't start again." For the rest of the week, she visited every evening. Fed the cat. Checked the mail. Tidied a little here and there. And even though the apartment was empty, even though she never saw her son, she felt closer to him here than she had in the past year. One day, standing in the living room, she caught herself thinking, if Ethan treasures this home so much, if he loves his family and protects them, then maybe he's doing okay. But if he's okay, why am I the one he keeps out? She had no answer. Maybe it wasn't just the computer that pushed him over the edge. Maybe it was years of built-up resentment for her control, her constant hovering, her inability to trust that he could handle life on his own. Maybe she had crossed lines without even realizing it. But she had done it out of love. Out of fear. And now all she could do was tiptoe around the remnants of a bond she once thought unbreakable. On the final day, Margaret arrived with the intention of giving the apartment a good once-over before Ethan and Claire returned. She tidied the kitchen, folded a few blankets, even left a small note on the counter. The cat was fed and seems well. Welcome home. She wasn't planning to linger, just wanted to do one last kind thing. But as she turned to leave, the sound of a key turning in the front door made her freeze. Ethan stepped inside. He wasn't supposed to be back yet. He stopped in the doorway the moment he saw her, his shoulders stiffening, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. For a moment, they just stared at each other, as if neither believed this was really happening. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low, already strained. Margaret fumbled with the cloth she'd been using to wipe the counter. "Claire asked me to look after the cat while you were gone. She gave me the key through your neighbor." Ethan didn't say anything for a second. Then, a short, bitter breath escaped his lips. "Of course. I could have handled it myself." Margaret wanted to explain, to say that she hadn't meant to intrude, that she was only trying to help. But something in his posture warned her to tread carefully. He looked exhausted, like life had worn him down further since the last time they saw each other, darker circles under his eyes, lines at the corners of his mouth that hadn't been there before. "I was just finishing up," she said quietly. "You're early." "We caught an earlier flight," he muttered. "Didn't feel like staying longer?" He dropped his bag by the door and stood there, clearly waiting for her to leave. Margaret swallowed hard. She knew she should go, let him have his space, but the urge to bridge the gap was overwhelming. "Ethan," she said gently, "please talk to me. I don't even know what I did. You stopped answering my calls. I haven't seen Katie in months. If I said something—" "I'm tired," he cut in sharply. "I don't want to get into this. Not now. Not ever, maybe?" Her throat tightened. She tried again. "I miss you. I miss her. I'm your mother. I don't understand why, You don't understand?" He laughed, a hard, humorless sound. "Of course you don't. You never did." Margaret felt herself shrinking under his glare. She had been prepared for coldness, but not this level of bitterness. "Look, I appreciate that you took care of the cat," he said, more calmly but no less distant. "But we're back. You can go now." She nodded slowly. "Okay. I'll go." She moved toward the door, heart pounding, legs weak. As she reached for her coat, she tried one last time, her voice barely above a whisper, "I just want to understand. I never meant to hurt you." Ethan didn't look at her. "You already did. And with that he opened the door for her. The hallway outside was dim and cold. Margaret walked down the stairs without looking back, her eyes burning, her chest hollow. It was one of the briefest conversations they'd had in over a year, but somehow the most devastating. At home, James listened quietly as she told him what happened. He shook his head, clearly frustrated on her behalf but unsure what to say. Maybe he just needs more time, he offered, not for the first time. Maybe when the dust settles, he'll come around. Margaret didn't respond. She couldn't shake the way Ethan had looked at her, like she was a stranger and inconvenience. Not the woman who had held his hand through years of sickness, who had stood by him when his father walked out, who had sacrificed everything for his sake. That night, she barely slept. Her dreams were full of stairwells and doors slamming shut. But by morning, she had made a quiet decision. Even if Ethan pushed her away, even if every attempt at closeness ended in pain, she wasn't going to give up. Not entirely. Maybe one day something would crack, a conversation, a crisis, a memory. She would be there, waiting. She didn't know what else to do. And as if the universe had heard her silent resolve, the phone rang that evening. Claire. Her voice was hurried, trembling. Mrs. Turner. I'm sorry to call like this. I didn't know who else. Ethan's in the hospital. Margaret's breath caught. What happened? His blood pressure spiked at work. He collapsed. They think it might be a hypertensive crisis, something stress-related. I don't have anyone to leave Katie with, and I need to go talk to the doctors. Could you? Yes, Margaret said immediately. Of course. I'm coming. She didn't care if Ethan didn't want her there. She didn't care if Claire had only called because she had no other option. Her son was in the hospital. Nothing else mattered. Margaret moved quickly, grabbing her coat and keys with trembling hands. James looked up from his book as she passed through the living room. What's going on? He asked, concerned. It's Ethan, she said, her voice already breathless. He's in the hospital. Collapsed at work. Claire needs someone to watch Katie. James stood up at once. Do you want me to come with you? She shook her head. No, stay here. It's probably going to be a long night. He nodded, squeezing her arm gently. Call me if you need anything. I will, she said, though her thoughts were already halfway down the street. The walk to Ethan's apartment felt longer than usual. The night air was cold, but Margaret hardly noticed. Her mind raced with fear, regret, 1,000 what-ifs. She knew how fragile Ethan's health could be, high blood pressure, a family history of heart issues. What if it was serious? What if he needed surgery? What if this was the last ail? Stop it, she told herself. You don't know anything yet. Just get there. Just help. Claire opened the door before Margaret had even knocked. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. Katie clung to her leg, wide-eyed and confused. Thank you for coming, Claire said quickly. I really didn't know who else to call. Margaret knelt down and gave her granddaughter a soft smile. Hey, sweetheart. It's okay. Mommy just needs to go take care of Daddy for a little while. Katie looked up at her mother, then back at Margaret, unsure. Claire gently untangled herself from the toddler's grip and kissed her forehead. Be good, okay? Grandma's going to stay with you. Then she turned to Margaret, lowering her voice. They've got him under observation. He's conscious now, but the doctors are worried. It may have been stress-related, but they're running more tests. Margaret's heart clenched. Do you want me to come with you? I can you. Claire shook her head. No. I need you here. Katie's scared. I'll call you as soon as I know more. With that, she was gone. Margaret closed the door and turned to Katie, who was already reaching for a toy on the floor. The child's innocence was a balm, a reminder that some things were still soft, still pure. They played quietly in the living room for a while, Margaret doing her best to keep Katie entertained while keeping an eye on her phone. Every time it buzzed, her pulse jumped. But it was never Claire. Not yet. Eventually, Katie grew tired. Margaret rocked her gently, humming an old lullaby until her eyelids drooped and her breathing slowed. When the toddler was finally asleep, Margaret tucked her in and sat back on the couch, the silence in the apartment now thick with anticipation. She stared at the ceiling, wondering if Ethan was thinking of her. Wondering if he was angry that Claire had called her. Wondering if he even cared that she had come. Her mind drifted to a memory, Ethan as a little boy, no more than 6, curled up on the couch with a fever. She had sat beside him for hours, wiping his forehead, reading to him, coaxing him to drink water. Back then he had looked at her with nothing but trust. When did that change? The front door opened just after midnight. Margaret sat up quickly. Claire stepped inside, her face still drawn but less frantic. He's stable, she said, kicking off her shoes. They're keeping him for at least 2 nights. He's exhausted emotionally and physically. The doctors say it was a combination of stress, overwork, and lack of rest. His pressure was dangerously high. Margaret let out a shaky breath. Thank God you were with him. Claire nodded, then paused. He was upset that I called you. I figured, Margaret murmured. But I told him there wasn't anyone else. I had to think about Katie. And deep down I think he knows that. Margaret looked toward the bedroom where Katie slept. Did he say anything else? Claire hesitated. He asked how Katie was doing. I told him you were here. He didn't argue. That, for Margaret, was something. Not a reconciliation, not even kindness, but the absence of anger. A crack in the wall. Do you need me to stay tonight? She asked. Claire nodded. If you don't mind. I'm too wired to sleep and she might wake up again. Of course I'll stay. They sat together for a few minutes in silence. Two women connected by one man and by the quiet burden of worry they both carried for him. Later, as Margaret lay on the living room couch, staring at the ceiling in the dark, her mind spun with everything unsaid. She knew now that she couldn't force her son to forgive her. But she could be present. Steady. Quietly waiting on the sidelines for when or if he reached out. And in the stillness of that night, despite the heaviness in her heart, she allowed herself one fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this crisis would be the beginning of something new. The next morning dawned pale and quiet. Margaret had barely slept, but she was up early, padding softly through the apartment to make a bit of breakfast for Katie. She didn't want to disturb Claire, who had finally dozed off in the armchair. Katie woke just after 7, her soft cries echoing through the hallway. Margaret scooped her up gently, whispering soothing words, and brought her to the kitchen where she made oatmeal and cut up some fruit. The little girl seemed calmer in the morning light, as if the tension of the previous day hadn't reached her completely. Claire emerged an hour later, her face creased from sleep, hair pinned up in a messy twist. Morning, she murmured. Coffee's on, Margaret offered, and Claire gave a grateful nod. They ate in relative silence, the only sound coming from Katie's spoon tapping against her bowl. After breakfast, Claire announced she was going back to the hospital. I'll be gone most of the day if that's okay. He has more tests and I want to talk to the doctor again. Of course, Margaret said. Stay as long as you need. I've got Katie. Claire hesitated at the door. Thank you, really. I know Ethan hasn't made this easy. But I think he's starting to see that you're not trying to push. Margaret didn't say anything at first. Then quietly, I'm just trying to be there. That's all. The hours passed slowly. Margaret spent the day with Katie, reading, coloring, building towers out of blocks. The child laughed more than she had the night before, and every giggle was like a balm to Margaret's tired heart. That afternoon, Claire returned with news. His blood pressure is down. The tests look okay so far, but they want to keep monitoring. He's very quiet. Doesn't want to talk about anything serious. But he asked if Katie was behaving. Margaret smiled softly. She's perfect. Claire paused. I think maybe you could write him a note. Something simple. He might not be ready for a conversation, but it could help. Margaret nodded. Later that evening, she sat at the kitchen table and carefully wrote a few lines on a piece of stationery she found in a drawer. Ethan, I know things between us haven't been easy. I don't expect anything from you. I just want you to know I'm here. I've always been here. I hope you feel better soon. Mom. She folded the note and placed it in a small bag of fruit and snacks Claire was planning to bring to the hospital. No expectations. No drama. Just a quiet offering. A few days passed. Ethan didn't respond to the note, but Margaret could sense a shift. Claire said he hadn't refused the bag. Had even eaten the apples. He read it, she told Margaret. Didn't say much, but he didn't throw it away. That was something. By the end of the week, Ethan was released from the hospital. The doctors warned him about stress and strongly suggested follow-up care and rest. He came home looking thinner, more worn out, but alive, stable. That was all Margaret needed. She didn't rush to greet him. Instead, she quietly packed her things and told Claire she'd head back to her apartment. As she slipped on her coat, Ethan walked into the hallway. He didn't say much. Thanks, he muttered, not quite meeting her eyes. For helping out with Katie. You're welcome, Margaret replied gently. I hope you feel better soon. He nodded. Yeah, me too. She opened the door, and just before stepping out, he added, Take care, Mom. It wasn't warm. But it wasn't hostile. And to Margaret, it felt like a door left slightly ajar. In the days following Ethan's return home, Margaret kept her distance. She didn't call. She didn't text. She didn't show up uninvited. Instead, she let the silence breathe, not as a punishment, but as a form of respect. It was the hardest thing she'd done in years. James noticed how quiet she had become again. You've been patient, he said one evening as they sat on the couch watching the flicker of a low-budget detective series. You did your part. Maybe it's his turn now. Margaret nodded, though her heart was heavy with uncertainty. She had accepted that closeness with Ethan might never return in the way it once existed. But she hadn't stopped hoping. And sometimes hope was its own kind of ache. A few days later, something changed. It began with a text. Just a few words. Katie's birthday is next weekend. We're keeping it small. You can stop by after the cake. Margaret stared at the screen for several minutes before she could bring herself to reply. Thank you. I'd love to. It wasn't a full invitation, but it was an olive branch. She spent the entire week preparing. Not just the gift, a set of colorful picture books and a soft teddy bear, but emotionally. She reminded herself over and over, don't ask too many questions. Don't bring up the past. Just show up and be kind. The day of the birthday, she dressed in her nicest sweater, curled her hair, and bought a small bouquet of flowers for Claire. James offered to come with her, but she declined. I need to do this by myself, she said. When she arrived at their apartment, the door was ajar. She knocked softly before stepping in. The living room was filled with balloons and laughter. Claire's voice floated from the kitchen. A few guests were already gathered, some neighbors, a couple of Claire's friends with their children. Katie sat in the middle of the room wearing a pink crown and gleefully smearing cake frosting across her cheeks. Margaret's heart swelled at the sight. Ethan appeared a moment later, holding a half-full cup of soda. He looked surprised to see her, but not upset. You made it, he said. You invited me, she answered gently. He nodded. Yeah, right? There was a pause. I brought Katie some books, Margaret said. And a bear. Thanks, he said. She'll love that. The exchange was short but cordial. A start. Margaret joined the group, keeping mostly to herself, smiling at the children, exchanging pleasantries with Claire's friends. When it was time to open gifts, Katie grabbed the bear from the bag and squealed with delight. Bobby, she shouted, holding it up. Everyone laughed. Margaret stayed just long enough to see Katie happily curled up in a pile of wrapping paper, then made her way to the door. Ethan followed her. Hey, he said. She turned to face him. Thanks again for coming. And for the bear. Margaret smiled. Of course. He looked at her for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then, softly, you can come by sometime, you know. If Katie's awake. Margaret felt her breath catch. I'd like that. Ethan nodded. Just, not too often. Okay. Okay, she agreed quickly. No pressure. Just when it's convenient. He nodded again, then stepped back. Drive safe. And that was it. But to Margaret, it was everything. That night, back home, she told James what had happened. He listened quietly, then reached for her hand. You're doing it. Slowly but surely. I'm trying, she said. God knows I'm trying. James smiled. You've always been the most stubborn one in this house. Margaret chuckled, then wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. It was strange how progress didn't come with fanfare, but with brief nods and quiet acknowledgments. Still, it was progress. And for now, that was enough. The weeks after Katie's birthday passed in a quiet rhythm. There were no dramatic shifts, no sudden revelations, just subtle signs that the ice between Margaret and Ethan was beginning to thin. Every now and then, Margaret would receive a short text. Katie's got a cold, staying home today. We'll be at the park Saturday morning. Or once, unexpectedly. Mom, what kind of soup did you use to make when I was sick? That last one made her hands tremble as she typed out the recipe, heart full of quiet wonder. She still didn't visit often. Ethan didn't offer frequent invitations and she didn't press. But she did drop off soup when Katie was sick, left a new set of watercolor paints when she learned her granddaughter liked to draw. And Ethan, he didn't push those offerings away. Sometimes he even said thank you. Claire remained a gentle bridge between them, always gracious, always attentive. She would send a photo here and there, Katie in a silly Halloween costume or scribbling on the wall with markers. She's wild today, Claire would write, followed by a laughing emoji. And Margaret would reply with a heart, sometimes with a memory of Ethan at that age. Just like her dad when he drew on our couch with crayons. She never overstepped. She never asked for more than she was given. And maybe that was what made Ethan slowly begin to lower his guard. One Saturday morning in late fall, Margaret was sipping tea by the window when her phone lit up again. We're at the park by the elementary school. If you're not busy, come say hi. She stared at the message for a full minute, blinking back tears. She didn't bother with makeup, just pulled on her coat and gloves, grabbed an extra thermos of hot cocoa, and headed out. The park was just a few blocks away. The trees were shedding the last of their amber leaves, the playground covered in a mosaic of gold and rust. She spotted them near the swings. Ethan was standing by the jungle gym, hands in his jacket pockets. Claire sat on a bench nearby, smiling as Katie tottered around in pink boots, chasing after a flock of stubborn pigeons. Margaret approached slowly. Claire waved. Hey, you made it. Ethan turned and nodded. Hi, Mom. Margaret offered the thermos. I brought some cocoa. Thought Katie might like it. Claire's eyes lit up. Perfect. She'll love it. Ethan accepted the drink without hesitation. Thanks. For the next hour, they stood together under a tree watching Katie run and fall and giggle. Margaret didn't try to make conversation. She just stood nearby, sipping cocoa, matching her breathing to the rhythm of the wind. Every now and then, Ethan would glance at her, not coldly, not suspiciously. Just normally. As if they were two people rebuilding something brick by quiet brick. Eventually, Katie ran up, arms outstretched. Bobby, she squealed. Margaret crouched, hugging her tightly. Her tiny hands were cold, her nose red, but her smile beamed with warmth. For the first time in what felt like years, Margaret let herself believe it, maybe things would be okay. On the walk home, the air was brisk. Her cheeks were stinging from wind, but her heart felt lighter than it had in a long, long time. Later that evening, as she told James everything, the swing set, the cocoa, Katie's laughter, he looked at her with quiet admiration. You waited, he said. I didn't have a choice, she replied. But it worked. She looked down at her hands, still chilled from the cold. Not fully. But we're on our way. And James nodded because they both knew sometimes love didn't shout. Sometimes it whispered. And sometimes that was enough. Thanksgiving arrived with gray skies and the first biting chill of winter in the air. Margaret didn't expect an invitation. Holidays, after all, were a sensitive topic. She had learned not to anticipate too much, better to be pleasantly surprised than painfully disappointed. But 2 days before the holiday, a message appeared on her phone. Claire wants to host a small dinner. Just us, nothing fancy. You can come if you'd like. She read it 3 times before replying. I'd be honored. Let me know what I can bring. Ethan answered hours later. Claire says pie. Apple or pumpkin? Margaret smiled to herself. She'd make both. Thanksgiving Day was quiet, peaceful. She dressed with extra care, not too formal, not too plain. She baked all morning, filling her apartment with the warm scent of cinnamon and butter, and wrapped the pies carefully in foil before walking the few blocks to Ethan's building. Claire answered the door in a soft sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. Hi, come in. You smell amazing. Margaret stepped inside and caught a glimpse of Ethan in the kitchen, carving the turkey. He looked up when he heard her voice and gave a small nod. Hey, Mom. Hi, sweetheart, she said, and he didn't flinch at the endearment. Katie came barreling into the room, nearly tripping over her socks. Bobby, she squealed and reached for Margaret's legs. Oh, my little wildflower, Margaret laughed, scooping her up and covering her cheeks in kisses. How did you get even taller since Tuesday? Dinner was simple: turkey, mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, stuffing, the pies. Nothing elaborate, but filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with food. They ate around the kitchen table, sharing small updates, laughing over Katie's attempts to feed mashed potatoes to her teddy bear. Ethan wasn't overly chatty, but he didn't withdraw either. He asked Margaret how her knee was holding up in the cold, whether James had fixed the radiator yet. They didn't dive into the past. They didn't pick at wounds. But they shared a meal, and that was enough. After dessert, Claire began clearing dishes while Ethan stayed at the table, sipping his coffee. Margaret stood beside him, brushing crumbs from her lap. That was delicious, she said. You helped, he said, then added, the pies were perfect. She smiled, heart swelling just a little. I still use Grandma Sylvia's recipe. He nodded, then glanced up. Katie loves having you around. Margaret hesitated. Do you? There was a pause. A long one. I think I'm getting there, Ethan said finally. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in years. She nodded, eyes stinging with unshed tears. That's all I need. Later that night, back in her apartment, she sat beside James on the couch, telling him every detail. He listened, as he always did, then kissed the top of her head. That's the beginning, he said. It feels like the middle, she murmured, curling into his shoulder. Like we're starting again. From a different place. Sometimes that's the best kind of start, he replied. Margaret didn't know what Christmas would bring. Or the new year. Or anything beyond that. But for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't afraid of the silence between them. Because now there was something on the other side of it. Hope. December came quietly, blanketing the city in early darkness and crisp air. Margaret decorated her modest apartment with familiar touches, a string of lights across the windows, the old ceramic snowman Katie had painted last year with Claire, a pine-scented candle flickering on the windowsill. She didn't expect visitors, but the act of preparing for Christmas made her feel anchored, grounded in a tradition that had once defined her world. Then, one snowy Tuesday morning, another message came through from Ethan. We're getting our tree this weekend. Want to come? She read it in stunned silence. I'd love to, she finally typed. Then deleted it. Then wrote again, thank you. I'll be there. Saturday arrived with soft flurries and icy sidewalks. Margaret layered up in scarves and mittens, carrying a small tin of homemade gingerbread cookies wrapped in wax paper. She told herself it was just a visit. Just a tree. But her heart thudded like it was her first date. The moment she stepped inside their apartment, she was hit by the smell of cinnamon and pine. Claire waved from the floor where she and Katie were untangling a knot of lights. Ethan stood by the front door, holding a freshly cut tree, snow still clinging to the branches. Hey, he said, a little out of breath. Could use a hand? She set the cookies down and joined him, helping guide the trunk into the stand. It took teamwork, a few quiet jokes, one crooked lean, and then finally the tree stood tall and straight. Katie clapped. Tree. Tree. Decorating became a ceremony. Claire handed out ornaments, Ethan lifted Katie to hang the star, Margaret knelt to plug in the lights. They laughed when the string flickered and died, and Ethan rummaged through drawers for a spare bulb. It wasn't perfect, the garland drooped, and Katie kept moving the same glittery penguin to the bottom branch, but to Margaret it was the most beautiful tree in the world. They drank cocoa afterward. Claire played holiday music from her phone, and Katie danced in circles, trailing bits of tinsel. At one point, Margaret looked up and caught Ethan watching them with a strange expression, not quite a smile, not quite sadness. Mom, he said softly as she helped Katie with her socks. She looked up. Yes. He hesitated, then sat beside her on the couch. I know we've had a lot between us, he said, voice low. And I know I haven't always been fair. But I see how much you're trying. And I see how much you love Katie. Margaret felt her breath catch. I guess I've just had a lot to work through, he continued. Stuff I didn't even realize I was holding on to. You don't have to explain, she said gently. No, he replied. I do. Because it wasn't just you. I made it hard too. She reached for his hand, unsure if he'd let her take it, but he didn't pull away. I'm still learning, he said. Still figuring out what kind of dad I want to be. What kind of son I can be. You're already both, she whispered. For the first time in years, they sat together in peace. Later, when she bundled up to leave, Ethan walked her to the door. Drive safe, he said. I will. He opened the door, but before she could step out, he added, we're doing Christmas morning here. If you're free. She looked at him, blinking in surprise. You're inviting me? He nodded. Yeah. I think. We'd all like you here. She smiled. Then I wouldn't miss it for the world. Christmas morning arrived with a quiet beauty, soft snow falling in slow flakes outside the windows, the streets still untouched, as if the world itself had paused to breathe. Margaret woke early, too early for someone not expecting a house full of guests. But today was different. She dressed carefully, a deep green sweater, her late mother's brooch pinned to the collar, hair pulled back neatly. In a simple gift bag, she placed a wrapped present, a photo album she had spent weeks making. Page after page filled with pictures of Ethan's childhood, notes scribbled in the margins, old cards, drawings, school programs. She didn't expect him to open it, but she wanted him to know it existed. James walked her to the door, coffee in hand. Big day, he said, offering a warm smile. Margaret took a breath. It is. Proud of you, he added. She squeezed his hand and stepped out into the quiet, glittering street. When she reached Ethan's apartment, the door opened almost before she knocked. Claire greeted her with a warm hug, wearing a red flannel robe and a tired but happy expression. Inside, the tree glowed in the corner, stockings hung from the shelf, and Katie was already wide-eyed in Christmas wonder, tearing at the edge of a gift before anyone could stop her. Margaret stepped inside, inhaling the smell of cinnamon rolls and pine. Merry Christmas, she said. Ethan emerged from the hallway holding a coffee mug. Merry Christmas, Mom. She blinked. You said it first. He gave a small smile. Yeah. Figured I should start somewhere. Claire handed Margaret a plate. You hungry? There's plenty. They ate breakfast together, watching Katie unwrap crayons, puzzles, and a tiny dollhouse. Margaret didn't try to take over. She sat quietly, joining in when invited, laughing when Katie pulled bows off gifts and stuck them to the cat's tail. And when the presents were done and the wrapping paper lay like a colorful sea around them, Ethan sat down beside Margaret on the couch. Without a word, she handed him the gift bag. He looked at it for a moment, then opened it slowly. As he flipped through the album, she watched his face, a frown at first, then a softened gaze. His fingers paused on a photo of him in 3rd grade, wearing a crooked paper crown and grinning with missing teeth. You kept all this? He asked. All of it, she said. Even the poem you wrote about spaghetti. He huffed a quiet laugh. God. She didn't push. Didn't explain the hours spent compiling, the memories revisited through tears. She let the album speak for itself. At some point, Claire scooped up Katie and went to the other room to lay her down for a nap. Ethan closed the album gently and looked at his mother. "I've been angry for so long," he said. "And I thought it was because of how you were, the way you worried, hovered, tried to control everything. But I think it was more about me. How I never learned to say no without guilt. How I felt like I had to push you away to feel like my own person." Margaret nodded slowly. "I know. I was afraid, Ethan. Afraid if I let go, the world would take you. I lost so much trying to hold on." He rubbed his eyes. "I think maybe we both lost something. But we're here now." She reached for his hand. This time, he took hers without hesitation. "I'm sorry for the years I shut you out," he added. "I'm sorry for the years I didn't know how to step back," she whispered. They sat like that, hands clasped, while the house settled into post-holiday quiet. And in that stillness, something shifted, not erased, not forgotten, but softened. Later, as Margaret slipped on her coat to leave, Ethan helped her with the zipper. A small gesture. One she hadn't expected since he was a teenager. "Come by again soon," he said. "I will," she smiled. "Only if I'm invited." He rolled his eyes playfully. "You're always invited." Margaret stepped out into the snow, blinking against the brightness, heartful in a way it hadn't been in years. She walked home slowly, letting the silence of Christmas morning surround her, warm her. When she entered the apartment, James looked up from his book. "Well?" he asked. She set down her bag and pulled off her gloves. "I think we're okay," she said softly. "Not perfect, but real. And maybe real is enough." James smiled and they sat together on the couch in the quiet. Outside, the snow kept falling. And inside Margaret's heart, the thaw had come. If you liked the story, give it a like, subscribe and share in the comments.